This is a podcast from the British Library. For more information, visit www.bl.uk/podcast.
Okay, so now we will start with the four panels of the conference. There are two today and two tomorrow. The first panel for today is Collections and Buddhist Practice, Text and Translation. It will be chaired by Matt Kimberley. Matt, as I said before, is a research fellow on the European Research Council project Beyond Boundaries, which investigates the transmission of Buddhism across Asia, and has a particular interest in Khotanese texts and in the history of science and medicine in pre-modern Asia. Matt is also doing fantastic work in cataloging our Khotanese fragments here at the library, and of course he was very instrumental in setting up the whole conference. So please welcome Matt here, and Matt will introduce then the speakers for the session.
Thank you very much. Good morning. It's so lovely to have you all here, and my thanks to Louisa and also to Birgit for a fantastic keynote paper there. It's interesting to know that she was concerned as to whether or not she even should give that keynote. When I received her abstract, the first thing I thought was, that's what this conference is about. So thank you very much for your really getting to the insight into why we're here. So yes, as Louisa mentioned, since we're having a conference on unlocking Buddhist written heritage, it didn't seem wildly inappropriate to begin with a panel on text and translations. Texts are, of course, an integral part of reconstructing the history of Buddhism, but that historical reconstruction itself, of course, frames our understanding of it in a contemporary setting. Translation, likewise, is such a fundamental part of that process of understanding the history of Buddhism, and I particularly like how you'd highlighted the fact that this is not, although perhaps our experiences of it as translators sometimes is quite a solitary one, it is not simply a case of singular text and singular translators working well on it, but a collective enterprise to reconstruct that meaning, or indeed wholly construct that meaning through our interpretation of them. So I'm very pleased that this panel will explore a lot of different aspects of texts themselves, their commentaries, their interpretation, their translation, and their circulation. So without further ado, I'll introduce the first of our speakers, Professor Stefano Zacchetti. He is the Johann Numata Professor of Buddhist Studies at Balliol College, University of Oxford, and Deputy Academic Director of the Oxford Centre for Buddhist Studies. His research interests are primarily in early Chinese Buddhist translations and the history and transmission of Buddhism from India to China. He's published extensively on the subjects of Mahayana and Buddhism in Sanskrit and Chinese, and the formation of the Chinese Buddhist canon. So if I can please welcome you to the stage. Thanks, Stefano.
40 minutes? Yeah, and then how do I move?
Matt's all the...
Perfect. Thank you. Wonderful. Okay, good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this wonderful conference that brings together so many different areas with the focus on this crucial topic of manuscripts. Translations were mentioned just a few seconds ago, and I would like to start with a quotation from, which I like very much, from an article, I believe, by Richard Salomon, and he wrote that Buddhism came to be almost from the beginning a religion of translation. And I like this statement because my main research area is on Chinese Buddhist translation. I think if you look from the perspective of Chinese Buddhism, well, this statement sounds particularly true. In China, the translation of scriptures from various Indian languages, which took place over many centuries, roughly from the 2nd to the 11th century CE, it formed a process of cultural transmission of unparalleled richness. Now, if we focus on the early phase of Chinese Buddhist history, roughly from the 2nd to the 4th century CE, which happens to be my main, the time frame of my research, the time frame of my research, then we can say that translations of Indic texts and commentaries on those translations were probably the most important types of texts produced by Chinese Buddhists during this period. However, the destinies of, as it were, of these two closely related types of texts were starkly different. Whereas translations, which surely overall were the more important of these two types of texts for various reasons, but while translations were collected in what gradually became the Chinese Buddhist canon, and as a result, they largely survived. And this is true even of many of the earliest ones, so even translations. We have a considerable body of translations produced during the 2nd century CE. So among actually the earliest datable Buddhist documents of any kind. On the other hand, early commentaries have almost entirely disappeared. Early Chinese Buddhist commentaries, or more precisely, the little that remains of them, will be the focus of my presentation. Commentaries represent commentaries represent one of the oldest literary genres employed by Chinese Buddhists. And they started, quite clearly, we have records of that they started composing commentaries of various kinds, essentially from the very beginning, as early as we have records. The link between translation and commentary is so very old, as old and profound. And looking at this from a Chinese perspective, one could perhaps say that since the Buddhists started to conceptualize the translated scriptures as Jing, a classic, and this was a very important pre-Buddhist, of course, a category, bibliographical category, of especially during the Han period, is a fundamental Chinese category. In normative, authoritative text, a text that can explain the world in a sense. That's what a classic is. And when the Buddhists started to translate their text into Chinese, and they were introducing something that was completely unknown, they labeled their text as Jing. That's a big claim. We now tend to see these as something obvious, but actually it was an important and bold cultural move in the first place. But defining their text as classics, in a sense, this very classification attracted the functional correlate of a classic, which is a commentary, reasonably enough. Now, time constraint does not allow me to discuss the early developments of this literature and the various forms of commentaries developed by Chinese Buddhists during the first centuries. But the predominant type, the predominant commentarial form from around the 3rd to the end of the 4th century CE is that of interlinear commentaries, or zhu in Chinese, and which usually include the entire base text. In this case, for early Buddhist comments, of course, it would be normally a translation, mostly of a sutra. So we have the whole text with glosses, interlinear glosses in smaller characters inserted between lines, and we'll see some examples in a moment. Interlinear commentaries represent, this is quite interesting, this is a quintessentially Chinese form that was adopted and adapted by Buddhists from coeval secular literature. So there were such commentaries on, let's say, literary Chinese texts, or Confucian texts, as sometimes we call them, and so on and so forth. And the Buddhists, as they adopted the notion of an authoritative text, the classic, they also adopted this particular commentarial form. An important feature of interest presented by these early Buddhist interlinear commentaries lies in what I would call the, in a sense, hermeneutical position. So where the authors were placing themselves with respect to the text they were trying to explain. And this is it's interesting. because in many cases I feel, having struggled on the very same text of my own, I feel I found some kindred souls out there, because in many ways the approach is similar. The earliest translations of Buddhist texts, so the ones produced during the 2nd century, during the later Han dynasties, are among the most challenging texts contained in the Chinese canon. So working out the literal meaning, understanding the syntactic structure and lexical choices often seem a hopeless task. And but the interlinear commentaries, we try to account for the already translated text. So these were composed by people who were facing the translated text, and they were very often on their own. They took although they also engage, of course, with the doctrinal context of the scriptures, the wording of the text, that's always their starting point. So they have to try, in various ways, often wonderfully creative ways, to make sense out of very problematic, very obscure words of the base text. So for them, as it is for us, the meaning of the translated text was often something of a problem. And here it is very interesting how different commentaries approach these problems in very different ways. Sometimes, that's very interesting, conceptualizing the base text as a historical construct. And so they said the translation is wrong, or something like that, or it's been transmitted with errors, or something like that. In other words, what we can also gain by reading these early commentaries is, in a sense, samples of historical readings. So what I mean by this is that, in a sense, we can, by seeing how they approach the text, how they conceptualize the text, which strategies they put in place to make sense of their text, we can see how a particular Buddhist scripture, translated scripture, was read in a specific historical environment, as opposed as how we would read the same text today, equipped with dictionaries, with, for example, knowledge of Indian parallels, and so on and so forth. But I think it's very important for reconstructing the intellectual history of Chinese Buddhism to be able to see how a particular text was read in a specific historical and cultural environment. And commentaries, I would say, are probably the only sources which really allow us to do this. So this is just to say something on the importance of these early exegetical literature. But in studying early Chinese Buddhist commentaries, we are immediately confronted by a rather basic problem. That is their extreme scarcity. Indeed, early commentaries can tell us, among many other things, a story of loss and survival. More loss than survival, but that's somehow what the situation we face. Then the question is, why most of the early commentaries perished, and how did the few remaining specimens survive? Well, I think there are technical reasons for these, and the most important one, which it's largely affected the commentaries. So the commentaries I'm discussing now are those of the very early phase, 2nd to 4th century, but this is largely true also of commentaries produced during the 5th and 6th century. They mostly disappeared. I mean, of course, less so for later ones, but still, if we think of texts, exegetical texts of which we had records and they're gone, it's a massive literature that was lost. And the main reason, I think, is the particular ideology underlying the Chinese canon. Especially as it started taking a more tangible shape from the 6th century on, where we started seeing actual collection of canonical texts put together on the basis of normative catalogues, telling what should be in and what shouldn't be there. And essentially, this is a canon that's made up of translations. And translations, the fact that the text was translated was the main criterion of canonicity in Chinese Buddhism. Commentaries being composed in China, they had no place, on their own in a canon of this kind. The issue of which classes of indigenous texts could be in the canon, that's a very interesting issue. It's more complex than what I'm painting here. But let's say that there was no existing slot, earmarked space for commentaries in the Chinese Buddhist canon until a much, much later stage, much later. So transmission of commentaries had to rely on specific communities of readers, and I have to say, I think that the need to transmit commentarial texts that were not in the canon might be an important factor in the formation of the so-called schools of Chinese Buddhism, where essentially communities of commentators, lineages, exegetical lineages, which had to transmit their texts, which otherwise would have been lost. So this is what I think is the overall the main reason for what we are experiencing. Now, then the other question, why, after all, we do have some few fragments. Now here, we deal with some interesting, I would call strategies for survival. Now one case, these are all very, very few, as I said, very few remnants, some very few cases, 3, 4 I can think of. Commentaries happen to be transmitted for reasons that are not very clear, together with their base text. So here is an example. So at least in some of the early printed editions of the canon. So what must have happened is that the particular set of manuscripts on which the ancestor of this particular printed edition of the canon, this is the important, historically very important second Korean edition of the canon on which most of the canonical editions which used nowadays are based. So not directly, this was not directly based on manuscripts, but its ancestor, a Chinese edition of the second half of the 10th century, was based on manuscripts. That's the first edition of printed edition of the canon. So the set of manuscripts on which the ancestor of this printed edition was based must have contained, for this particular text, also, as you can see, a commentary. These are the small, this is the interlinear commentary. This is an exceptional case, and in this case, inclusion of the commentary in the canon happened, in a sense, silently. There is no mention of this commentary in catalogs, but they found in their manuscripts, and they had the very good idea of keeping it and reproducing when they committed the text to the printing block. So this is one strategy of survival. As I said, 3, 4 examples of commentaries. This particular commentary, the base text translated in the 2nd century, the commentary on basis of most internal evidence, 3rd century. So this is really early, this is early and very important stuff. Another strategy, or let's say, well, another situation that we face, some commentaries were explicitly or implicitly misinterpreted as translations. So jolly good, so they were as such enjoyed canonical status, and that increased by 2, maybe 1 or 2 units, the small library of this early exegetical literature. Then we have fragments of other commentaries, but these are really lines quoted in secondary transmission, I mean indirect transmission, so other commentaries quoting lost commentaries or things like that. So there is a little bit. And finally, and this is really the topic where the topic I'd like to focus on, finally we have the text, early text transmitted to, let's say, what would have been, from the point of view of the center of Chinese Buddhism, marginal areas, such as, for example, Dunhuang area, or even Japan from that point of view. They were preserved in manuscript form. So this is an example. This is a Dunhuang, manuscript from Dunhuang in the Pelliot collection of an early commentary, probably 4th century, on an early 3rd century translation of the Vimalakirti Nirdesha. Again, here you can see how visually the layout of interlinear commentaries, you have the entire base text in these larger characters, and then half their size, you have the lines of the commentary. Of course, this is extremely easily conducive to conflation of text, base text and commentary. That goes without saying. Commentaries, a few fragments of commentaries have been preserved in this way. I think for the most part are few folios remaining, but still, given the the general situation of scarcity, I mean absolute scarcity of a loss of early commentaries, these are still welcome additions and are extremely important, and we can get valuable information by reading these documents carefully. So as I said, well, this is a bit what the title is like evoked by the title of my presentation. Yes, we do, in the few surviving specimens of early Chinese exegetical literature, we do face the scattered debris of a larger textual shipwreck. And the scriptural class, which a type of Indian Buddhist text that suffered particularly severe losses here, a shipwreck within the shipwreck, as it were, are commentaries on Prajnaparamita texts. Prajnaparamita, a perfection of insight or of understanding, is a crucial teaching, but also a massive, substantial textual corpus that remained important throughout the history of Mahayana Buddhism. And this tradition, Prajnaparamita, some of the texts, 3-4 important Prajnaparamita texts were translated into Chinese in the early centuries, and for various reasons, this is all quite well known and well studied, attracted the attention of Chinese monks, but also lay people, and especially in the 4th century, we have a flourishing, again, mainly known indirectly from historical records, we have a flourishing of exegesis and debates and discussions of Prajnaparamita literature, which also, were Buddhist ideas combined with ideas from indigenous philosophical movements in a very, very important cultural blend, which is well studied. So you can read about this in all the main histories of Chinese Buddhism, Tan Yong Tong, Zhihe, Tsukamoto, and so on and so forth. But how did the people actually understand Prajnaparamita texts in that period? That's something that we have to guess more than we can know, because we've lost, again, most of this literature. So the loss here is particularly severe because the exegetical literature on Prajnaparamita text was particularly rich. And we know we have this tantalizing list of the existing texts and the names of the scholars who were interested in Prajnaparamita during especially the 4th century in South Central China, and very little has survived. So this is just give some information on the trajectory of Prajnaparamita texts in medieval China. Here the one text that was particularly important is still very important nowadays for understanding the history of Prajnaparamita is the so-called Tao Xing Jing, translated, and we have a very precise date for the translation, in the second half of the 2nd century by the famous Lokakshema with collaborators, who was the first person to, as far as we know, to introduce systematically Mahayana Buddhism to China. Now, this text had, it's an early parallel to what later was classified as the Ashtasahasrika Prajnaparamita, or the perfection of insight in 8,000 lines, and actually was probably produced from a Middle Indic, probably Gandhari original, in the 2nd century by Lokakshema and others. And all in all, this is an extremely important text for studying the history of Prajnaparamita and indeed the early Mahayana thought. But at the same time, this text, in ways that sometimes for us are slightly amusing or perhaps even hard to understand, it became rather popular in some intellectual circles, even of lay persons, who apparently enjoyed reading and commenting and debating this text. And so this was perhaps one of the two most important Prajnaparamita texts from the point of view of also of the Chinese reception in the 3rd, 4th century CE. I'll quote here a couple of well-known passages from the Shishuo Xingyu, by Liu Yiqing. This is a collection, it's a very interesting text. It's a collection of anecdotes and witty statements and dialogues by various intellectuals in the early medieval period. And there are a couple of passages that center on the figure of Yin Hao, who was, 4th century, a politician and an army man, and a failed army man, who was exiled at the end of his life, as that was happened quite often, and there were even worse possible case scenarios, but he was just exiled, and then spent his last years pondering over Prajnaparamita texts. So here is one passage from recording what he was doing from Richard Mather's translation. So you can see that this gentleman, a retired gentleman, he enjoyed reading the smaller version of Prajnaparamita. This must be the Tao Xin Jing I've just mentioned before, and he jotted down a couple of hundred annotations, etc., etc. And then he wished he could debate this with Zhi Dun, who was a very important monk of the time. Here is another passage from the Shishuo Xingyu, again with our gentleman in Hao, when he was dismissed. This is exactly how he used his a couple of years in retirement, reading Buddhist texts. And here is quite interesting because you can see he was reading the shorter Prajnaparamita, so the Tao Xin Jing, but also the larger. And I will come back to the larger in a moment. And because so he was comparing the two and was finding one too short and the longer too long. Okay, that's fair enough. But this is just to give you an idea of how this text had a broader impact that we might think nowadays, especially trying to read them. So going back to our manuscripts, I mentioned before the importance of early manuscript fragments, especially from the Dunhuang area, also some from Central Asia. Turfan, for example, they are very important. Chinese, also very important Chinese Buddhist fragments. The one I would like to focus on today in the rest of my lecture is a manuscript that I believe should be here in the British Library, a manuscript, Dunhuang manuscript Stein 4313. Now this is exactly an early commentary on the Tao Xin Jing. I know only of another manuscript fragments. Both these were brought to my attention, kindly brought to my attention by Professor Fang Guangchang, who is one of the greatest experts of Chinese Buddhist manuscripts, and he also kindly gave me his unpublished critical edition of this and another manuscript fragment, which I believe is preserved in China, and that's also an early commentary on the Tao Xin Jing. So these are essentially the two remaining fragments of what was a very, very large, substantial exegetical literature. So there is an intrinsic historical interest just for this reason. But as I will show, this is a very unique commentary also from another point of view. This is a commentary covering one portion of chapter 1 of the Tao Xin Jing. Professor Fang dates the manuscript on paleographical grounds to the late 4th to early 5th century CE. It's a very old thing. You can clearly see especially the the style, the ziti, the style of the characters is quite indicative of that period. I have no idea as to who could be the author, whether this was part of something large or what was it. This is essentially one disembodied fragment that just come down from somewhere. And this is a situation we actually often face when we deal with these early remnants of this early exegetical literature. So that's a challenge. What do we do with them without knowing, or we can only make polite inferences, guesses about who could be. So that's a challenge that we face when studying this text. There's no idea of who he was, but I would say it's quite clear it cannot be later than the 4th century, and I would say that's more or less where it belongs. So the point is also that overlapping largely with the date of the manuscript itself, this could be a manuscript that essentially was produced with the text itself or a very early copy of that. The layout is unique as far as I know, because in fact it's not really an interlinear commentary of the typical type, although it looks a bit like that, because it doesn't reproduce the whole of the base text, but only shortened lemmata. So these large-sized characters, either 3 or 2, and perhaps they are, well, I think they are usually 3 or 2 characters. These are shortened lemmata, and then basically the gloss following them refers to the whole passage that's summarized by these 2. So here is, okay, so the dates, according to Professor Fang, as I mentioned, this is again, you can perhaps see the manuscript in a larger, in a slightly higher definition picture. This is the text. So basically, I just highlighted in the text of that passage of the Tao Xing Jing where these lemmata are. So you can see it covers actually. So in a normal interlinear commentary, you would have found the whole thing into the text. So this saves a lot of space because essentially it's evoking only the key words. They're not really keywords, but they are meant to refer to the whole passage preceding them. So it saves a lot of space. And of course, it means that the people reading the text were very familiar with the Tao Xing Jing, which is not surprising. So the layout is really quite unique. Now, as I said, dealing with a fragmentary text like this, it poses several methodological problems. So what you can do without knowing anything is to see how actually these people read the text. So focusing on exegetical techniques, which is, in a sense, is not linked, so you don't need any particular historical information to make some sense of them. So how did they read? So what kind of reading of the base text these commentaries reflect? And this is quite interesting because, and you can bear in mind this second of these anecdotes I quoted on this politician. First of all, that's a basic strategy. This commentary adopts a kind of comparative approach. So in this specific case, the commentator compares the passage of this version of the Prajnaparamita with the parallel passage in the larger Prajnaparamita. So Prajnaparamita literature, in Prajnaparamita literature, works through patterns of expansion and compression. So the early text, which was shorter and of which this Tao Xing Jing represents the earliest translation, was in India, let's say, for short, expanded into a larger text. And this expansion was made in various ways, but sometimes by adding words, reformulating the base text. And so, in a way, the expanded version can be used as a commentary. And actually, of the shorter text. And actually, this is how it's used also in Indian exegetical literature. For example, Ratnakarashanti Saratama, which is a commentary on the Ashtasahasrika, in some cases at least, uses the larger version, Panchavinshati Sahasrika, the version in 25 lines, as a commentary. Very much in the way that this early Chinese commentary is doing. So what they do is that they read the base text by looking at the parallel version in the larger Prajnaparamita, and they draw on that by reformulating the base text in the gloss. So I'll give, in the little time I have, we can look, I have to skip this. Here is an example, for example, and we know that this way of using parallel version as a exegetical strategy, we know of that existence in China, but we don't have documents, whereas this at least is a document of a similar approach. So in this case, just quoting a short passage, so he's just remarking, compared to the Fangguan Jing, so the expanded text, the text of the Tao Xing Jing is a bit shorter. There should be a question by the Buddha at this point, which is an interesting it's an interesting way of saying, it's sort of questioning its base text by saying, well, here actually it should be a bit longer. It's a very interesting approach. Not all commentators do that, for example. Maybe I'll skip and quickly go to, yeah, there was much more. One quick, it was a bit unrealistic. Another way that, so basically, how did these commentators read their text? Well, basically, they read their text by rewriting them. So a very common strategy that you find in interlinear commentary is the use of paraphrase or reformulation of these archaic translations, and in a way to make them more readable, perhaps, but also that allows the commentator to add more explanation, to unpack certain meanings that they felt were only implicit in the base text and they made explicit in the gloss. Now, here is an example. So I put in red what is the passage of the base text that this commentary is referring to. So the red one is the Tao Xing Jing text. So this is the passage that's been commented on, and it refers to the bad teacher, the Papamita or something. So the persons who try Mara or something like that to move the Bodhisattvas off their track by advising them to follow other teachings or something like that. So here the base text says the bad teacher teaches the Bodhisattva these matters, urges him to follow his teaching, and then let him recite the text that has taught. So texts which are in contrast with Mahayana. Now, you can see how that, so in the commentary, this is the to-be characters that signal the part which this gloss is referring to, and then you can see that the commentary here is essentially reformulating the base text. The bad teacher teaches, the Bodhisattva practices, providing the merit for a heavenly rebirth. This is not something that's in there, but it kind of makes sense because, in fact, as it is presented by in the Asya Sahasrika, the bad teacher, or Mara sometimes, is essentially suggesting to the Bodhisattva, why would you want to become Buddha after so many years? Just get saved now or get a rebirth in the Svarga, in the heaven. So this is somehow, it sort of makes sense. It's a nice exegetical, but also, he also teaches the perverse matters of the small vehicle, so-called Hinayana. Urges him to follow his teaching, so he would then recite the text. So as you can see, this is largely reframing the base text and unpacking some of the expressions that are, in a sense, virtually present in the base text, but here are made explicit. Now, there are patterns in these reformulation, in these paraphrases, that is really one of the key hermeneutical strategies that we found in all these interlinear commentaries, Buddhist and secular as well. Actually, it's quite interesting. So generally, the structure of the sentence and the verbs are kept, but the nouns are changed. So, for example, the verbs here, he instructs, urges, and then he recites. These remain the same in the base text and in the relevant gloss. But what in the base text is simply this matter, is expounded in the merit that grants rebirth in heavens and the evil teachings of the small vehicles. So yes, time to conclude. I just wanted to give a few examples of the ways in which this text reads. I think the use of parallel sources, it's really of considerable historical interest, precisely because we know of the adoption of this particular commentarial strategy, but we had to guess what they were, in which way that generally worked. Although this particular commentary, this single folio, doesn't quite fit in the descriptions of these sort of synoptic commentaries that we know of, it still shows one way in which parallel versions would have been used in a commentary of this kind. And I would say more in general, and this probably I can close here, commentaries are really extremely important for when we really want to study Chinese Buddhism, early Chinese Buddhism, from the point of view of its intellectual history, which ideas, because in a sense, most of the textual documents we have produced during these first centuries are translations. And so they largely reflect an external input. Of course, translation is not just that, because first of all, there might be patterns of choice that made certain texts translated on others, which then would reflect something of at the receiving end. And then, of course, translations are highly creative processes. So the choice of words and so on is certainly nothing mechanical there. But the commentary, that's something different, because commentary really reflects in a much more direct ways which are the interests, which ideas, which words, caught the attention of the readers and triggered sometimes creative hermeneutical processes, generating new meanings. That's very often, we could classify that as misunderstanding, but I would rather say, well, I don't want to say alternative truth or something like that, but in a sense, there is the idea of generating in very creative ways new trends of ideas. So commentaries are very important, and I would say it's largely unexplored, gold mine, small one, but largely unexplored. Thank you for your attention.
You've been listening to a British Library podcast. For more information, visit www.bl.uk/podcast.